Hi, I'm David Tao and welcome again to the Theories of Everything program. This is another of our programs covering theories of existence, the big questions. We've already run a couple of these programs, a couple of topics covering the future of life and are we living in a simulated existence. We've also covered part one of the nature of reality, and this is a second part to that topic because it's a very big topic and there's a lot to cover, even though we are skimming the surface. Now, the interesting thing about the nature of reality is that the human mind has evolved and we've become better at understanding the nature of reality. As the human mind has become more complex, we've been able to get a better grasp of reality. So our picture of reality has also evolved with the complexity of the brain. Remember, the very first animals probably struggled to differentiate and categorise the sensations they felt, the different wavelengths of light reaching them, the different touch sensations, the different taste sensations, the different temperature sensations. They had to learn to categorise these. Their ability to do that evolved, and as they did that, they were able to internalise the nature of those external stimuli. In other words, they were able to bring their consciousness, their embryonic consciousness, to bear on different wavelengths of light and subjectively see different colours, as we do. They are able to bring their consciousness, internal brain neurons to bear on sensations of force, softness, hardness, etc., and categorise those according to whether they would be a threat or not to them. So these qualia, these sensations, gradually became categorised according to species. Now, they do vary within a species. Obviously, some people, for example, are colourblind. But basically, these variations are very small, and when they occur, they're understood by the others in the species. But you usually have to go through a process of sensation to understand what it means, and to be able to empathise and communicate with others. In other words, the sensation of pain, the sensation of hardness, the sensation of black, white, redness, whatever. So reality is a subjective thing. We're interpreting, a little like the Matrix, again, the Matrix film, we're interpreting our reality from the photons, from the electromagnetic wavelengths that are reaching us and being interpreted through our eyes, our visual cortex, our auditory cortex, etc., through all the mechanisms we've evolved to pick up these sensations. We're creating our reality. Of course, as well as I mentioned in the first program about simulating reality, we're also doing that in the form of games, such as Civilization, for example, a major game that's shared across the internet today. So, once we've established that, we can see that our understanding of reality continues to evolve, continues to progress. And one of the most important ways, as I mentioned in the previous program, is that it continues to progress in terms of understanding dimensions. Very briefly recapping from the previous program, we live in a three-dimensional spatial world with time as well, which Einstein combined into a single entity space-time. But we've learnt to adapt and survive in that three-dimensional world. Thinking about higher dimensions is difficult for our brain to encompass. There are various tricks we can use. We can use interplays of shadows, we can take cross-sections of objects, we can try to understand the fourth spatial dimension, perhaps even the fifth. But it's difficult, but it's also necessary because the reality we've constructed may not reflect, if you like, the broader reality that exists. And certainly it seems that there is a broader, higher dimensional reality out there that that we need to understand if we're going to progress our knowledge and be able to survive better. So higher dimensions or higher geometry were first defined in terms of a mathematical object, mathematical equations, by Riemann in about 1860. He extrapolated beyond Euclid's simplified geometry to understand and to define a geometry of any number of dimensions. Einstein took those equations and applied them to his a new concept of gravity, mass, matter, energy, warping, space, time. He was able to develop so-called field equations. A field allows the definition of a force, the defining of a force at any point in space, at every point and any point where the force acts. So his field equations were able to define the impact of forces at any point in space-time on the warping of space-time. A very geometric approach, a very elegant approach to solving the problem of gravity. Gravity equals geometry. In the process, he had to move, though, to that fourth dimension, and so he used Riemann's equations to do that. Now, beyond that, others like Kaluza that I mentioned briefly extended those number of dimensions to encompass other forces, the electromagnetic force, for example. However, at around that time, a new way of describing reality, describing the forces of reality, describing particles of reality, started to emerge, a very powerful technique in the form of quantum theory. So everything was quantised under this theory, and also every particle could be represented in a wave form as well. Einstein's theory of relativity looked at smooth processes in the large scale, smooth warping of space-time. Quantum theory got to work at the very subatomic level and represented everything in chunks. Also, applying a particular type of theory called gauge theory that says that you can maintain the symmetry of a particular field when it undergoes stress or undergoes action, outside action by a force, by providing a compensating force, by generating a compensatory force to retain that symmetry. Maxwell used it in his electromagnetic equations. If the electric field changes, it has a counter effect on the magnetic field and generates a new force, the electromagnetic force. Einstein applied it in the large when mass or energy warps space. It does so in terms of the geometry of that space and generates a gravitational force to compensate. Now, quantum theory took that a stage further, and there were a number of players involved, Richard Feynman being one, who developed the quantum electrodynamic theory. And an electron wave, if you can retain the symmetry as it is rotated through space-time, conserves charge, and that was a critical element in the whole theory. And also there are other symmetries that balanced out changes and forces applied to the weak nuclear force and the strong nuclear force. Those three representations were represented further by mathematical objects called groups. But the whole thing was, the whole arrangement of quantum theory was as a gauge theory, and from that which developed the Standard Model, which showed that matter was made up of quarks, different types of quarks, different energy levels of quarks, different neutrinos, electrons, and so forth. The only problem with that theory was that it was unable to represent gravity for a start, and it seemed to only work in low dimensions, 2, 3 or 4 dimensions. So perhaps what we were seeing here, the particles and forces and the constants of nature, such as the speed of light, weren't really constant. They were only constant in low dimensions and at low temperatures. So viewers, in our previous program on the nature of reality, we mentioned two new players in the game that have come along in the last 10 years. One is string theory, that works best in 10 dimensions or even 11 dimensions. And basically that says that particles are made up of vibrating fluxes of energy in higher dimensions. depending on the frequency and resonance of those fluxes, of those vibrations, you have different particles, including at the lowest level, the graviton particle representing gravity. So this was a breakthrough, but we had to get that breakthrough, you had to go to a higher dimension. And still space-time was played out in the background. This theory was so-called not background independent. It relied on a static background, vibrations in higher dimensions against that background. The other radical player in the game is called loop quantum gravity. Both these theories are theories of quantum gravity, trying to bring Einstein's relativity theory together with quantum theory, the large and the small. Now in this theory, particles' forces are represented by loops of energy, but in this case they're linked together in networks. They're linked by, or knotted together, and the way they to form little networks called spin networks, because that's an analogue to the electron spin, the electron angular momentum in quantum theory. But basically these networks are made up of links and nodes. The nodes represent component bits of volume of space-time, because as with string theory it was predicted and discovered using this theory that space-time is quantised, space is quantised, and no doubt time is as well. In other words, it's not continuous, it's not smooth at the lowest level, it's in little chunks. But by building up these networks, so-called spin networks, that represent chunks of space, linked in various ways and combined in various ways, again out comes properties of particles and forces. At this stage not all of them, but the work goes on because already it's produced good predictions. But it's also produced a radical breakthrough in terms of being background independent. It doesn't depend on some sort of static background. Basically, the spin networks create the background. They are it, they are space-time as they evolve. Remember, space-time for Einstein evolved also. As it was impacted by mass or energy, there's continuous gravity ripples going on, continuous evolution. It also is a background independent theory. At the quantum level, so is loop quantum gravity, independent. And it also can ripple with gravitons at the tiny level. In fact, both these theories, and also to some extent string theory, are geometric theories, following from Einstein, cutting loose from quantum theory. And of course being able to explain a much greater range of forces and particles because they work in higher dimensions. So these are networks, as we described previously, of evolving relationships within these networks. It also represents events and processes, and one of the big breakthroughs was that we're not talking of objects here. Objects are an artefact of our reality in our three dimensions, but artefacts are very static and are only instants in processes. As described previously, all of us, all our artefacts, the cup, myself, the camera, are snapshots of ongoing processes back to the past and into the future in various forms. And this loop quantum gravity exemplifies this. It actually brings this process thing out and looks at space-time as managing flows of information between events and processes, causal relationships evolving constantly and in any dimension that's required, any dimension at all. Now viewers, with this view of reality as information-based, if you like, constantly evolving, we begin to get a whole new view of the universe. One of the outstanding things that have come out of this study is that the information that generates, if you like, what we see, the objects and artefacts of the universe, which are parts of processes, started off at the Big Bang level with a very small amount of information, a screen full, a hard disk full of information, because information relates to the number of quantum states that were there at the beginning of the Big Bang, if you like. And it looks like as if this universe perhaps emerged from a black hole, and it was the study of black holes, the study of their volumes and their surface areas that, as well as the combined with new theories such as loop quantum gravity, that provided insights into the enabling us to figure out the amount of information driving the universe. And it started off at a very small level, because it appears that the information basically that drives a particular volume is represented on the surface of that volume. So a three-dimensional volume, the number of ways events can happen inside a three-dimensional volume, such as a universe or a black hole, can be represented, the number of ways is represented by the number of pixels of information on the surface. And that's a very relatively small amount of information compared with the amount that you would think could be held by the volume. So this is called the holographic principle, one of the most amazing principles to emerge in the last 5 years. So, but more than that, this small amount of information obviously isn't enough to drive the universe. If you now add up all the quantum states in the universe, you'll get a figure of information working on the surface level of around about 2 to the power of 120, which is more than the number of particles in the universe. So where did it all come from? Well, we'll be going into this in future series of complexity. The universe, space-time, the laws of space-time, particles, etc., appear to be emergent properties of this original base of simple information. Complexity has gathered momentum over time, has increased over time, until it produces worlds and galaxies and life and everything in it, vast amounts of information, vast numbers of quantum processes, but that's emerged from a very, very tiny base. So this is another new way of looking at reality. So viewers, what have we got here? We've got a space-time and a universe that's been built from pseudo-objects, if you like. It's been built from simple objects, relatively simple objects like spin networks, the edges of which establish the weighting of the relationships between different parts of space. It's evolving over time, and it increases in complexity. So we have an emergent universe, an emergent space-time that comes out of something much smaller. And there are other types of pseudo-objects too that are being experimented with inside computers based on information, such as the G-bit pseudo-object. The G-bit establishes trees of connections. It looks like trees of connections between matrices, between mathematical objects, using mathematical equations, and it evolves, it expands like space does. It also has topological defects like we imagine space has also. So, and it generates objects such as wormholes and black holes. Out of mathematical objects emerges this, if you like, a pseudo-universe, but as with loop quantum gravity, a real universe emerges from these connections, causal processes, events, etc. We're modelling here, we're modelling the universe, we're seeing it emerge. However, it really does emerge, it appears, from information and energy. And there's a close link between information and energy, which we've spoken about. Also, there are others experimenting with mathematical structures that says that every type of mathematical structure, complex numbers, real numbers, etc., generate their own types of universes. There is a universe for every type of mathematical structure, most of which would not generate life because the dimensions are either too large or too small or whatever. But universes could exist for each of these mathematical constructs. So pseudo-objects are being used to create universes in a way that wasn't conceived of before and allows much wider understanding of reality. But viewers, what we're looking at is not the whole thing. We're looking at actually a hidden reality. Now, a hidden reality is evident from the fact that there are such things as not only pseudo-objects but quasi-particles. actual real world, if you like, in our world, particles that are different from their components. And we can look at that in a broader sense, such as a flock of birds or a hive of bees. Those forms are quite different from the individual form of the bee or the bird, from the behaviour of the bee or the bird. And it doesn't really give us an insight into those lower components. And this occurs with other groups of, if you like, phenomena, groups of particles such as vibrational waves, which are called phonons, charge waves, which are called plasmons. These exhibit quite different properties than the individual components, particles that make them up, and therefore they cover up their tracks. They cover their tracks, and we can only see the behaviour of these emergent quasi-particles, again, which are quite different from their components. This occurs also with for example, in a very important way, with a superfluid called helium-3, which exhibits physical properties which reflect the properties of the universe, which comes to another aspect of reality, that there seems to be a connection between the very small virtual particles that make it up, the quasi-particles, and the whole universe itself. They're connected, and they're connected immediately in the form of so-called non-locality phenomenon. When two particles have been connected, they're over the other side of the universe. A change in one is reflected in a change in the other immediately. And this probably happens through higher dimensions. Again, our higher dimensional approach to reality gives us a clue to what's going on. But there's always an underneath hidden reality which we can't get at. What I'd like to finish on, actually, is the nature of the universe itself, its shape, and how it possibly emerged very briefly. We'll perhaps run another show on how the universe began, the latest theories. But it appears that some of those curled up dimensions in string theory, for example, which are believed to be very tiny, some of them are perhaps very big, or at least a millimetre in length, or perhaps infinite in size. And in fact, our universe is three-dimensional. It's a three-dimensional membrane, but floating in a higher dimensional space, a 4 or 5 or 6-dimensional space. And those other dimensions are all around us, but we've no way of connecting to them except perhaps through the force of gravity. And experiments are being conducted now to work that out. So this is to test that theory. So this is called, if you like, brain world. The world of brains, and perhaps the collision of two brains caused the Big Bang in the first place, the release of energy. And again, we'll go into that later. We'll also talk about how the universe perhaps evolved, or is just one of many in a multiverse, and it just happens to be one in which life can form. But there is an evolutionary approach to this as well as the third alternative course of intelligent design, which we'll come to in this big picture series. So viewers, it looks like we'll never know it all. We'll never know all about the nature of reality, the exact nature of reality, what it is and where it comes from. But it doesn't really matter, because the journey itself is fantastic and the knowledge keeps growing day by day. We'll be talking about the latest updates to the nature of reality in many future programs. My name's David Tao, and you've been watching the Theories of Everything program again. I'll look forward to talking to you again next week.